The night, shrouded in gray mist, seemed to have fallen along with the last boxes that Danny, his mother Sarah and younger sister Lisa carried into the gloomy hall. The old mansion on the outskirts of the city stood alone, as if forgotten by everyone, and its dark windows looked at them with cold, empty glances. Danny, a 15-year-old teenager, stepped cautiously over the threshold, feeling how the cold air of the house got under his jacket. Enormous rooms stretched like endless labyrinths, smelling of dampness and mustiness. At first glance, it seemed that the house was simply old and had not seen repairs for a long time, but something about it did not give peace. An unknown heaviness hung in the air, forcing one to feel an invisible gaze on oneself. The wallpaper on the walls was faded and peeling in places, exposing old darkened boards. The ceiling was covered with cracks, like thin, dangerous cobwebs, and the wooden floors creaked under every new step. Sarah tried to smile, encouraging the children, although her own eyes betrayed a slight worry. She stepped toward the central staircase that led up to the bedrooms, and with an effort pulled a thin curtain of optimism. Well, let's put everything in its place. It will be quiet here. No fuss and traffic jams, just silence and nature around. Liza, an 8-year-old girl with expressive eyes, squeezed her mother's hand tightly, carefully looking around. Her gaze stopped on an old mirror by the stairs, framed by dark, as if shrouded in shadows would. The mirror showed a reflection of the hallway, but it looked slightly distorted, as if something had flashed in the shadows at the edge, barely perceptible. But Liza quickly looked away, trying to drive away her fear. She wanted to hide and not let go of her mother's hand. Danny, silently looking around the house, felt like something invisible was sneaking up on him, standing behind him and watching his every move. It was hard for him to explain this strange feeling, as if the walls were not just old brick and wood, but something alive. When everyone went to their rooms and silence reigned in the old house, Danny heard a barely audible sound, as if someone was quietly whispering his name, Danny. But he only shook his head, deciding that it was just an echo of the old house, and rushed to unpack his things, trying to distract himself. The old house on the outskirts of the city seemed not so empty anymore. The first nights in the new house were restless. Danny lay in his bed, listening to strange sounds that seemed to come to life only in complete darkness. The house seemed to breathe every creak of the floorboards. Every quiet movement in the silence sounded like someone carefully stepping along the corridors. One night, he thought he heard a barely audible rustling just outside the door, but when he plucked up his courage and looked out into the hallway, he saw nothing but blackness. The next morning, at breakfast, Danny carefully shared his feelings. "I think someone walks around here at night," he muttered, trying to keep his voice from betraying his anxiety. Sarah grinned, nodding at the sound of branches knocking against the kitchen glass. "You know, this house is old," she said. "The wood creaks, and a draft can cause little things to move. It's common for buildings like this." However, Danny had a hard time accepting this explanation. He was sure that he had heard not just a creak, but someone's footsteps. And when he returned from a walk the day before, he noticed that the antique clock in the living room, which had long since broken and stood in the corner as a decorative element, had suddenly appeared in the middle of the room. He clearly remembered that on the first evening, having just arrived, he had passed it. It stood by the wall, covered with a thin layer of dust. Trying to justify this strange phenomenon, he asked his sister if she had moved anything in the living room, but Lisa only shook her head, looking at her brother with curiosity. "Maybe you just forget where things are," Sarah suggested, hearing his reasoning. "Moving is always stressful. We all get a little confused." But Danny could not shake the feeling that something was wrong here. It seemed to him that every evening the house only increased its strangeness. Over the next few days, he noticed a few more inexplicable little things. His book, which he left on the nightstand by his bed, turned up on the windowsill one morning. A pen, placed on the table, disappeared and then turned up under his bed, although he clearly remembered not having touched it. And then one night, just as he was dozing off, he heard a sound that immediately woke him up, a rustling sound, as if someone was carefully moving around his room. This time he felt not just anxiety but fear. Trying not to breathe, he listened tensely into the darkness. There was something unnatural in this rustling, as if someone was crawling, moving invisible objects. He closed his eyes, trying to convince himself that it was just rats or the wind outside the window. But the more nights passed, the louder the sounds became, the more noticeable these movements around seemed. On the third day of his stay in the mansion, Danny, trying to distract himself from the obsessive feeling of anxiety, decided to explore the house more closely. The floors and walls of the house seemed to hide secrets, and this drew him, like the magnetism of something forbidden. At some point, when Lisa went for a walk with her mother, his feet themselves led him to the stairs leading to the basement, a dark, cold place where none of them had ever gone down. Danny walked down, lighting the way with the flashlight from his phone. Half of the lights in the house did not work, and the light seemed to be unwilling to penetrate the old basement. Descending deeper and deeper, he felt a strange, tangibly heavy feeling pressing on his shoulders, as if someone was standing next to him and watching him from the darkness. His attention was drawn to an old wooden door, almost merging with the wall and closed with a rusty lock. The lock looked ancient, almost fused with the wood. Danny gently pulled the handle, and to his surprise, the door gave way slightly, revealing a narrow gap. He pushed it harder, trying not to make any noise, and the door creaked open, letting him into a dark, dusty room. The flashlight illuminated the old things scattered around the room, as if someone had left here in a hurry many years ago. The shelves along the walls were filled with boxes, some of which had fallen apart with age. Strange objects gleamed dully in the light of the flashlight: glass bottles with dark liquid, thin mirrors with cracked surfaces, gloves, as if someone had left here in the distant past. But what caught his attention most were the children's toys. Dolls, teddy bears and wooden horses were scattered on the floor, all covered in a thick layer of dust. The dolls, with faded eyes and cracked faces, seemed eerily alive, as if they were waiting for someone to play with them again. Some of them were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, as if they had been left there by children who had lived in the house decades ago. In the far corner lay a music box, which Danny carefully opened. The music box began to play a thin, trembling melody with a creaking and rattling sound, making his heart skip a beat. It was sad, faint music, like a memory of someone who had long forgotten this house. The melody vibrated in the cold air, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. Danny took a few steps back, and the light from his flashlight suddenly fell on a small portrait on the floor. It depicted a family surrounded by gloomy surroundings: a father with a stern expression, a mother hugging a little girl with large, worried eyes. And then Danny felt that he was not alone in the room. As if something invisible and heavy was reaching out from the darkness behind him, pressing on him. An inner voice told him, "Go away now." He closed the music box, and the sound stopped, leaving the room in an ominous silence. Danny ran out of the room, feeling how with each step something seemed to be reaching out for him, stretching out from the shadows. He quickly closed the door behind him and noticed that the lock somehow clicked again, as if the room itself did not want to let its guests out. As he went upstairs, Danny felt as if he was under a heavy gaze. The same trembling melody that he had heard in the box continued to sound in his head, and every time he closed his eyes, the toys and dead eyes of the dolls standing in the room that seemed to have been buried and abandoned long ago appeared before him again. After his discovery in the basement, Danny couldn't shake the nagging feeling that someone was watching them. His mother's words about old houses full of creaks and echoes now seemed useless to him. The ominous melody of the box continued to sound in his head, and he barely slept, feeling as if the house around him was breathing and living its own life. One rainy day, Danny went to the local library, hoping to find at least some trace of the previous owners. An idea occurred to him: maybe something really did happen in the house. He delved into the newspaper archives, leafing through the yellowed pages of the local press, and finally came across an article from September 1952. The article told about the disappearance of the Winslow family, the previous owners of the mansion. The headline caught the eye: mystery on the edge of town, Winslow family disappears from their own home without a trace. Danny read on. The article revealed that the Winslows were a respectable family. Their father, Henry, worked at the local bank, their mother, Lydia, did charity work, and their daughter, Evelyn, was a quiet girl who often played alone. One day, neighbors noticed that the Winslows' windows were darkened and the house was empty. No one had seen any of the family members for several days. Local authorities searched the house but found no signs of a struggle or signs that anyone had left in a hurry. It was as if the family had vanished into thin air. The deeper Danny delved into the archives, the more disturbing the details became. It turned out that the house on the outskirts of town had brought misfortune to its owners before. Almost every generation had been faced with disappearances or deaths, and everything remained shrouded in mystery. Some newspapers reported rumors that there was something evil in the house, that it lived and breathed, that one day it would take those who lived within its walls for a long time. Danny felt a chill run down his spine. When he found another article, published in 1938, he could barely finish reading it. It told of an even earlier family that had disappeared without a trace, leaving only their belongings and a strange toy room that no one dared to open after children's laughter was heard there, even when the house was empty. With horror, Danny realized that the toy room in the basement that he had discovered was the same one. He remembered the sinister dolls, the antiques, and the eerie melody of the box. All of this seemed to be part of the curse that the newspapers wrote about. He hurriedly gathered up the printed articles and headed home, feeling the anxiety in his chest grow stronger with each step. He needed to tell his mother, but as he approached the house, he wondered what he would say. Would she believe him? Or would she just assume it was part of his fears about moving? But Danny knew one thing for sure: the mansion on the outskirts held terrible secrets, and someone or something didn't want them to stay there for long. Night had fallen on the old mansion, filling it with silence and a coldness that sent shivers down Danny's spine. He lay in his bed, the blanket pulled up to his chin, listening to the sounds that seemed to come from the most hidden corners of the house. Ever since he learned of the mansion's past and the strange disappearances of its previous owners, his nights had become even more disturbing. Every rustle seemed ominous, every creaking movement seemed to warn him of something terrible. That night, when he finally managed to doze off, he suddenly woke up with the feeling that someone was calling his name. A quiet, barely perceptible whisper crept through the darkness, making his heart beat faster. Danny. Danny. The sound was almost imperceptible, but insistent, as if someone nearby was whispering right in his ear. And it seemed to him that the whisper was coming from the depths of the house. With bated breath, he listened again, holding his breath, as if afraid that any movement would reveal his presence. The whisper repeated itself over and over, insistently, stretching through the walls and floors. There was nothing familiar about it, no male or female voice, just a cold, muffled whisper, faceless and alien, as if from another world. The voice was calling him, and with each repetition, Danny became more and more aware of where it was coming from. From the basement. "Bye, Cry-Frey." Danny felt his body grow heavy, but as if by inertia, he was already getting out of bed, not understanding why he was giving in to this calling whisper. Before he realized what he was doing, he found himself at the door of his room, stepping out into a dark hallway where a single, weak light from the window cast shadows on the walls, creating frightening silhouettes. With trembling hands, he turned on the flashlight on his phone and slowly headed for the stairs leading down. Each step seemed painfully long, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the shadows around him weren't just figures, but something more, something alive, something awaiting. The whispers grew clearer, louder, as if urging him on, as if there was something lurking around every corner that would grab him if he hesitated. Danny stopped in front of an old locked door as he descended into the basement. The whispers were right behind it, filling his mind and making his blood run cold. The door was firmly closed, but now the lock looked broken, as if someone had tried to open it before. His throat went dry, and the thought flashed through his mind that something terrible was waiting for him behind that door, but the ominous call did not let go, filling his consciousness like an echo. His hands shook. Danny pulled on the handle. The door swung open easily, revealing the same room with toys as the day he had first discovered it. Dust, the smell of dampness and antiquity enveloped every corner, but the room looked different now. It was as if something had changed in it. The toys were arranged differently. One of the dolls was looking straight at him, and the box from which he had heard the melody was again slightly open. And then he heard the whisper even more clearly. "Danny, come here." His gaze fell on the doll standing against the wall. Her large, faded eyes seemed to follow his every move. For a moment it seemed to him that she swayed slightly, as if nodding to him, agreeing with the call of the whisper. A slight chill ran through his body, and Danny felt as if his feet were rooted to the floor. He could not take his eyes off the doll, as if she was leading him into another world where only darkness and fear awaited. The whispers grew louder, filling his head, making it impossible to think clearly. The room was drawing him in, becoming a trap from which he could not escape. The night was heavy and oppressive. The house was absolutely silent, broken only by the distant sounds of the old walls creaking and a barely audible rustling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Danny lay on his bed. Insomnia had fallen upon him again, forcing him to listen to the darkness that surrounded his room. He could not get rid of the strange feeling that someone was here, in his room, something was moving and watching him. In an attempt to get rid of anxiety, he sat up in bed and, leaning his elbows, mechanically slid his gaze across to the mirror opposite. Usually he did not pay attention to this object, but today something drew him to it, like magnetism. In the reflection he saw his pale figure, but as soon as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something vague. Just over his shoulder, in the depths of the mirror, a shadow flickered, blurred like the trace of a hand, subtle and frightening. Danny turned around instantly, but there was nothing behind him. Returning his gaze to the mirror, he noticed that the shadow was there again, but now it seemed clearer, like a ghostly silhouette leaning towards him from behind. For a moment, it seemed to him that the face in the shadow had slightly lifted, and empty eyes were looking at him. He jumped out of bed, recoiling from the mirror, feeling cold sweat run down his back. The mirror only silently reflected his frightened face and the dim shadow behind it, which seemed to freeze, not wanting to let him go. In that moment, he realized that the house was not just watching them, but also trying to get closer to them, leaving its traces in the darkest corners. The next morning at breakfast, he tried to tell his mother and sister about it, but he couldn't bring himself to talk about the shadow in the mirror. Instead, he asked, "Doesn't it seem like there's someone here?" Sarah tensed up, but quickly hid her worry behind her usual smile. "Danny, just get used to it. It's an old house, and it has its own peculiarities." But Lisa, who usually kept quiet when talking about the house, suddenly shuddered and added quietly, "I saw a strange woman at the window, Mom. She looked like a shadow." Sarah tried to calm Lisa down, but her eyes flickered with alarm. It seemed that even she was beginning to notice the oddities, but she tried hard to ignore them, hoping that it was just the children's imagination. However, in the evenings the house became colder and colder, and the shadows became more and more noticeable. That night, when Danny couldn't sleep again, he heard his mother quietly talking to a friend on the phone. He overheard her say, "Sometimes I feel like there's someone here, but that's impossible, right?" From that moment on, the whole house seemed to come alive. In every mirror that Danny encountered, he noticed dark, elusive silhouettes moving behind his back. When he passed mirrors in empty hallways, it seemed to him that in the reflection he saw not only himself, but also something else: the silhouettes of previous residents, those who had once disappeared from this house without a trace. Now the whole house was eerily silent, as if in anticipation, and each of its inhabitants felt that they were no longer alone here. The darkness that enveloped the room pressed down on Danny, plunging him into a heavy, disturbing sleep. He dreamed of familiar images: the empty eyes of dolls in the basement, ominous shadows in the mirrors, faceless silhouettes sliding past in the dim light. But suddenly the dream ended, and he woke up with the feeling that someone was standing next to him. Opening his eyes, he immediately felt that he was not alone. His body was tense, as if he had been awakened by an unknown alarm signal. The room seemed to be plunged into impenetrable darkness, and the weak light from the window only slightly outlined its contours. Danny wanted to turn his head, but he could not, as if someone was holding his hands, restricting his movement. He tried to breathe deeply, but his breathing was ragged. It was as if his hands were pressed to the bed by icy, invisible fingers, and every effort he made to free himself only increased the pressure. Panic flooded his consciousness. He wanted to scream, but his throat seemed to be constricted, and no sound came out. Fear, icy and paralyzing, seized him, and at that moment he heard whisper. Ominous and cold, the voice sounded right next to his ear, as if someone leaned close and breathed words onto his skin. "Danny, you won't leave. You belong here." The whisper sounded like an echo of a distant, alien world, inhabited only by despair and darkness. The voice was familiar, but now it seemed more insistent, almost furious, as if something had finally decided to show itself. Danny felt his body go numb with horror, and the voice continued to sound, filling his mind with unbearable, cold pain. The whisper did not stop, and with each phrase it seemed that the icy hands were tightening their grip. "You opened the door. Now you're ours." The voice was getting closer and closer, and he felt something cold touch his cheek, as if an invisible ghost had run a finger across his face. At that moment he felt a strong tug, as if someone was trying to pull him out of his own body, and a strange cold stream rushed through his body, depriving him of his last strength. The room seemed to spin, and he suddenly noticed vague images before his eyes, figures of people standing in a circle, their faces distorted with horror, as if frozen in a silent scream. Suddenly, something seemed to let him go. Danny felt the weight on his arms disappear, and he could breathe again. He inhaled convulsively, breaking free from the sticky shackles of invisible hands, and jumped out of bed in a panic, running to the door, trying not to look back. The whole house was filled with the same cold and darkness that made him feel trapped. He barely knew what he was doing. His only desire was to get out. When he reached the hallway, Danny felt like the house was breathing around him, and the shadows on the walls were shaking as if alive, reaching out to him, not wanting to let go. He managed to get to his mother's room and woke her up, covered in tears and in a panic. She barely understood his mutterings, but the sight of his pale, confused face made her believe that something in the house really was trying to get to her son. They sat on the floor, hugging each other, afraid to move, and in the silence of the night they both felt as if something in the darkness was watching them, something that never knew peace. The morning after that nightmare came with a sullen silence. Danny woke up with difficulty, feeling how his body still remembered the invisible hands that squeezed him, not allowing him to move. He sat on the edge of the bed, choking with horror, and tried to convince himself that it was just a nightmare. But deep down he knew that he could not be so wrong. The house had changed, became different, it was alive, and every breath it took filled the space with darkness. When he approached his sister Lisa's door, he noticed that something was wrong. The room was empty. Strange, because Lisa always woke up first, even before their mother, and now, instead of hearing her light steps, everything was dead silent. Danny opened the door, hoping that she was simply sleeping with the alarm turned off, but looking at the bed, he realized that she was gone. Her things were still there, toys, books, even her favorite doll, but Lisa herself was gone. He checked every corner of the room, looked under the bed, opened the closet. She was nowhere to be found, gone, like everyone before her. Panic gripped him again. He felt his heart begin to beat faster. It was just like the story of the Winslow family. One by one, everyone had disappeared, and now his sister was gone too. But something strange was happening to him. The same whisper was still in his head, but now it was more insistent, more furious, as if something was hurrying him. "You must come." To the room the whisper was familiar, but now there was something new in it. He knew that it sounded not just like an order, but like a call that could not be ignored. Unable to resist, Danny walked down the hallway, his steps sliding uncertainly across the floor. He found himself in front of that very basement again, in front of that terrible door leading to the room he had once discovered. He didn't want to go, but the steps seemed to be leading him there on their own. When the door opened, he felt how the air became colder with each step he took, and the space around him was shrinking, like in a cage. Down below, in the semi-darkness, there was only an empty crib. It seemed new, perfectly made, but for some reason it radiated a strange, eerie feeling. The edges of the blanket were neatly tucked in, but there was an unbearable feeling of emptiness on the face. This object seemed to cause not just anxiety, but a deep, painful longing. Danny felt his heart pound even harder, and his hands began to tremble. He slowly approached the crib, as if under hypnosis, and tried to touch it, but at that moment shadows began to appear on the walls. They were barely visible in the darkness, but the longer he looked, the more of them there were. These figures were moving, approaching him as if they were alive, and the whispers continued to fill his mind, draining the last of his strength. "You are ours. You will come here, just like she did. All we need is you." The whispers grew louder and clearer, as if there was no end to them. He realized that he was not just trapped, he himself had become part of this nightmare, part of a dark circle that involved everyone who had ever lived in this house. And when he turned away from the crib to get out of this room, the shadows on the walls began to move faster, as if they were going to grab him. But the scariest thing was that in one of the corners, where before there was nothing, he saw Lisa. Her face was pale, her eyes were wide open, but her expression was empty, like a doll's. She stood in the corner, motionless, as if waiting for him to come. In her arms was the same doll, only now it seemed even older, with cracks on its face, as if it too was a part of this world of darkness. Danny felt the ground slipping from under his feet. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fight this evil that had captured his sister. But one thing was clear: he couldn't leave her here. He realized with horror that all this was not just his nightmare. It was reality, and now he was a part of this horror. With each passing day, the house became more and more hostile. Every shadow, every rustle began to seem even more threatening, and the darkness that surrounded it was not just darkness, but something alive, something inhuman. Danny felt that he and his family were not just victims of the evil that lurked in this place, they were part of its plan, and the more he tried to escape, the more it pulled him back. He could no longer wait, he could not just stand aside. He had to act. After Lisa disappeared and the whispers grew louder, Danny decided that he needed to find out what this house was hiding and confront what was haunting his family. He could no longer just be an observer. He had to find the source of this evil and destroy it. But where to look? And what really happened to the people who lived here before him? In search of answers, he headed to the basement again. That time he had been there, he had noticed strange symbols on the walls, symbols that were barely visible in the dim light. He had always avoided them, but now he knew he could no longer hide from them. They were signs left by those who knew of the dark power of this house, and perhaps they could tell him how to defeat the evil. The basement was the same as before: dark, heavy air, and the smell of damp. But now Danny saw it with eyes full of determination. He knew that if he did not discover this secret, it would be too late. He began to explore the floor, picking through old boxes, throwing out things that had once belonged to previous residents: old books, toys, letters. He ignored all of it until he came across a small wooden box hidden behind a bookcase. His heart began to beat faster. The box was covered in dust, but clearly had not been disturbed for a long time. He carefully opened it and found several old folders with yellowed pages inside. They were sealed and filled not only with records of past residents, but also with strange drawings and texts that seemed familiar to him, the same symbols he had seen on the basement walls. They were runic signs, long forgotten, used to seal away evil or summon it. Danny felt a chill creep into his soul. He picked up one of the pages and, not wanting to think, read a few lines out loud. The words seemed to immediately come to life in his head, echoing in his consciousness, causing strange visions. He saw old photographs of smiling families standing at the threshold of this very house. But then the photographs became blurry, as if someone was wiping their faces. The ghosts of those people whose eyes were no longer visible slid across his mind. Suddenly, he came across one particularly disturbing letter. It was addressed to those who lived in this house in the future. It read, "The house will not let you go. It will take everything you hold dear. Do not trust its promises. We tried to stop it, but it was too late. It will come for you." Frantically turning the page, Danny found another terrible symbol. It was an ancient image he had never seen before, but it seemed alive, a round figure with crisscrossing lines and eyes from which blood seemed to flow. In fact, it was not an image, but a seal that kept the dark power in this house. Danny realized this was not just a house. It was a trapped portal, a trap that used families as a source of its power. Evil was bound to this place, and it could not leave until it had everything it needed. In fear and determination, he he felt the whispers calling to him again. Now he knew that he was not just part of this game, but the one who could break its rules. He closed the files, knowing that he had to go to the very heart of this horror, to the secret room, to the seal. He had to break this cycle and destroy the source before it was too late. But the house did not want to let him go. When Danny returned to his room, holding the old journal in his hands, his heart was pounding and his mind was filled with anxiety. He knew that everything he read in the entries was the key to their salvation. The understanding came too late, but now he had to act. The house was alive, and the evil it hid never let go of those who crossed its threshold. But there was one possibility. In the journal, among the ancient notes and spells, he found what he was looking for: a way to break the spell. To get rid of the evil spirit, it was necessary to go through the portal in the very depths of the house, where the seal was kept. But according to the author of the journal, it was not so easy to break it. The spirit of the house did not allow its confinement to be broken. It guarded its world, and if someone tried to leave, it did everything to prevent it. Danny knew that his family needed to leave the house immediately, but he could not shake the feeling that they were already in a deadly trap. With each passing minute, the spirit grew stronger. He felt its presence around every corner, in every rustle, in every glance from the mirror. When Danny told his mother what he had found, she didn't believe it at first. She had tried too long to convince herself that it was all just a fantasy. But when she saw the shadows begin to move around the house and felt that incessant cold, she realized that it wasn't just fear, it was reality. They were all in danger. Realizing that time was running out, they packed their things, trying to escape from the house. Danny found Lisa. She was sitting on the floor in the room. Her eyes were empty, like a doll, but her body was back. He knew that she was not dead, but something had changed in her. She was a part of this world, and he couldn't leave her here. They approached the door, and then the house seemed to come alive. A strong gust of wind suddenly slammed the doors, and a cold, terrible voice cut through the silence again. "You will not leave. I won't let you go. You are mine." The room began to sway around them, and the shadows on the walls began to gather into shapes. The windows began to freeze, and the doors began to creak, as if the house was trying to squeeze them inside. The spirit was here, and it was strong. It was not going to let them go. Danny felt his strength draining away, and all his thoughts were cut off. But suddenly, remembering the words from the journal, he realized that the only way to break this barrier was to destroy the seal. He remembered the ancient symbols carved into the basement walls, and he knew that they had to go there. But to do so, he would have to destroy not only the magic, but also fight the house itself. They ran out into the hallway, terrified as the walls began to creak, and the shadows, like living creatures, tried to grab their legs. Every step was a fight for life, and with each movement, the house became more cramped and unbearable. Danny felt his heart pounding, but he knew he had to get to the end. When they reached the basement, the terrible door appeared before them again. But now it was engulfed in light, emanating from ancient symbols that began to flicker. Danny placed his hands on the door and spoke the words he had learned from the journal. He did not know what would happen next, but his body instinctively followed the text, bursting from the depths of his subconscious. Like an explosion, the house shook. The floors under Danny's feet began to crack. The walls shook. The air was filled with the smell of burning, and something inside his heart seemed to break. An explosion of light, and the door in front of him disappeared. They burst outside, but the world beyond the threshold was strange. The wind seemed too cold, and the sky became covered with clouds. However, despite this, a feeling of liberation burned in their hearts. The house didn't seem to be watching them anymore. It wasn't their prison, and they were free.